Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to point out that the land on which we gather here tonight is Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are gathered here today, both in person and online, to celebrate the launch of the new book by Méira Cook, The Full Catastrophe, to which you may applaud. It is so fantastic to be able to gather and celebrate this book. We are so incredibly excited whenever a new publication from Méira is forthcoming. Personally, I fell in love with her voice when I first encountered her poetry, and the fact that her novels have just built on those strengths and allowed both her incredible insight into character and her playfulness with language and her mastery over both to shine even, well, not even more, but in a very different and wonderful way is just entirely tremendous. So I'm so pleased we could gather here to celebrate. I'd like to extend special gratitude, of course, to House of Anansi Press, both for publishing this book, which is a vital part of any book launch, but also for helping to set up this event as well, too. We're so grateful for their support and ongoing partnership. I am the least interesting person who will be speaking here tonight, so I'll try to keep my part brief. So just a few very quick housekeeping notes before we get things underway. While you're in this space, we will just ask that you remain masked. You'll notice that anybody who ventures behind a microphone will remove theirs temporarily if they feel comfortable doing so. There'll be a reading from this podium, followed by a conversation, which will take place to my left. And then after that, there'll be an opportunity for all you folks to ask questions. And that opportunity is extended to both you gathered here in person, as well as you watching online. If you're online, please feel free to write your questions into the chat, and we will put them to Méira as time permits. And if you are present here, as it still seems a little bit unwise for all of us to share a single microphone, I'll just ask you to ask me the question, which I will then repeat into the microphone for the benefit of all those watching at home to ensure they're able to hear your query. Now, as I can't possibly do justice to the inevitable eloquence of your words, I would ask that you keep your questions relatively brief and ensure that they are questions. Rest assured that all the lovely things that you have to say to Méira about her work, any further incredibly extensive interrogation, can be put to her as soon as she moves to the signing table afterward. There'll be ample time for that. The only other thing I'll mention is that we will ask at the end of the event for you all to remain seated for just one moment while we safely transport Méira to that table, after which I will let you know when it is time to descend and have your book signed. But that is more than enough for me. The Full Catastrophe is a novel of psychological complexity, tenderness, humor, and community. It is about becoming men, a novel of secrets, and the journeys these secrets propel. Its author, of course, is Méira Cook, the award-winning author of the novels Once More with Feeling, The House on Sugarbush Road, which won the McNally Robinson Book of the Year Award, and Night Watching, which won the Margaret Lawrence Award for Fiction. Born and raised in Johannesburg, South Africa, she now lives and writes in Winnipeg. Your host for the evening, Alison Gilmor, is a Winnipeg-based freelance journalist and educator. As well as being a pop culture columnist for the Winnipeg Free Press, she has written on art, design, books, and film for The Walrus, Border Crossings, Canadian Notes and Queries, Canadian Geographic, Canada's History, The Globe and Mail, and The Winnipeg Review. She has taught in the History of Art program at the University of Winnipeg as a contract academic staff member, as well as in the McNally Robinson Community Classroom. We'll hear from Alison shortly, but for now, please join me in welcoming the incredible wordsmith and the mellifluous voice of Méira Cook.
Thank you, John. I think it was the late, ever so cool Leonard Cohen who said, the last time I heard him, he said that he came to Winnipeg and he said that it was a pleasure to play for us at that time together in the places of light when most of the world was still in darkness. And those words struck me because it feels like we're in a place of light at the moment, coming out of 2.5 years, being allowed to gather in these communal public ways, while much of the world is in darkness. So I hope you will allow me to use this word. So, because this book is quite playful, and I'm here with my great playmate, Alison, my co-reader, rereader, writer, and I'm very grateful to be allowed to play for you. Thank you to McNally Robinson, who has kept us healthy during these, psychologically, mentally, spiritually healthy during these 2.5 years. To House of Anansi, which is a wonderful press. Where is my camera? Mr. DeMille, there it is. Thank you to House of Anansi. Had a wonderful editor, Joshua Greenspan, and my new friend and mentor, Debbie de Groot, comes to us this this year, Debbie from Toronto via South Africa, where we were both born. So this book, so thank you again to be readers and writers again in public is quite a wonderful thing. To my wonderful family, thank you. So the full catastrophe is about Charlie Minkoff, who's a 13-year-old boy with intersex traits, and his grandfather, Oscar Wolf Minkoff, who's in his 90s. And despite the fact that there are these vast differences in age and experience, they are each other's confidants and best friends, and always have been. And Charlie learns during a school project that his grandfather has never had a bar mitzvah because the war intervened. He went through the Holocaust and that was not possible. So he decides to give this great gift to his grandfather. A recent interviewer said to me, Charlie is obsessed with telling his grandfather's story. He doesn't tell his own story. And this is, of course, the problem. So I'm going to start by reading from the beginning, which is really about Charlie's birth. This is the moment of Charlie's birth. The trouble with Charlie was he couldn't make up his mind. But as his grandfather, Oscar Wolf Minkoff, pointed out, it wasn't the poor kid's fault. Indecision wasn't necessarily a matter of choice. The fact that the doctors were struggling to assign the newborn a gender, to declare an M or an F, was just one more example of vacillation that was surely not, at this early stage, Charlie's fault. The way Oscar told it, Charlie Minkoff came into the world shrieking like a banshee, the proud possessor of 10 fingers, 10 toes, 2 neat ears, a comically snub nose, a well-developed sense of outrage, and a healthy pair of lungs. A tonsure of pale hair stood out around the infant's head like dandelion fluff, and 2 large, slightly protuberant ears completed the picture. Little frog, his grandfather exclaimed fondly, stroking the baby's cheek. The child was perfect, Oscar thought, sincerely puzzled by the doctor's insistence that something was wrong, gravely wrong. He just needs time to make up his mind, Oscar said. Give the little frog time. That's not how time works, snapped the surgeon, a ghastly man. But Oscar, in the course of this reminiscence, realizes that time is what cures despondency. And he knows this because he's raised a child of his own. Oscar had raised his little daughter as best he could, given her perverse nature, her fiercely independent spirit, and her flagrant disregard for convention, all of which Oscar understood was because Jules was an artist, had been since birth. That was how it was, he reflected. You began as you meant to go on. But when he tried to explain this point of view to Charlie's surgeon, the man convulsed with rage, banging his fist into his palm and speaking so emphatically that he bit each word off at the root. Perhaps this was why it took Oscar a moment to realize that the terrible man had called his grandchild a ticking time bomb, whose controlled detonation he was willing to oversee, but whose artistic success he could not guarantee. Sarcasm would never be enough for some folks, Oscar reflected. In addition, they had to use finger quotes to express their disgust. In response, Oscar brought up one of his favorite stories, cat in a box, as he called it. The short of it was that if a cat got stuck in a box, you could never be sure what was happening in that box until you lifted the lid. Cat could be asleep, cat could be awake, cat could even be, God forbid, passed away. The trick was to let cat make its own decision, with the understanding that whatever happened, the cat could never go against its nature. It could never, for example, become a dog, or here Oscar turned the finger quotes he'd so resented back upon the surgeon, a bomb. Fascinated by Oscar's highly original interpretation of Schrödinger's thought experiment though she was, Dr. Jabur felt obliged to intervene. A pediatric endocrinologist, she'd been called in for a consultation and, like Oscar, had taken against the surgeon's harrowing sense of emergency. In the flurry of chromosomal testing and analysis of genital tissue that the surgeon had insisted on ordering, and the ensuing brouhaha about what to do, what choices to make, hers was the voice of reason. The decision is up to the child, she said. I look forward to watching him grow into an extraordinary young person. Or her, she amended hastily. Now, here was Charlie, 13 years later, still at 6s and 7s. But despite what Jules had written on the wonder wall, the boy wasn't angry at God or mad as hell. He didn't hate his mother. He hadn't given up on his deadbeat father. And he hardly ever wished he'd never been born. On the contrary, Charlie was hopeful, prone to hope as others are to asthma or allergies. This dogged optimism verged on foolishness, his grandfather sometimes thought. But foolishness, as Oscar knew, wasn't the absence of light. It was the absence out of which the light could be separated from the darkness and the heavens from the earth. And I'm going to read a short extract, the last one, from a little later on in the novel. This is when Charlie's grown up, 13 years old, and Oscar is still looking at him with wonder. Afterwards, when everybody was asking what he'd been doing, who did he think he was and what was his problem, etc., Charlie remembered how events had escalated gradually, imperceptibly, until he was in over his head, a frog croaking its heart out in a pot of boiling water. If you wanted to boil a frog without that frog realizing what you were up to, you had to proceed with caution, Jules had said, as if explaining a recipe. A couple of degrees an hour, the water heating slowly, the frog acclimating to its environment, feeling no pain although it was being boiled alive. This was a precious story, a touchstone to something Charlie couldn't quite grasp because when you got right down to it, it made no sense. Why was the frog in the pot and who was gunning for it? What was the ratio of heat over time? And given the circumstances, why not just whack the little green fella over the head with the down lid and be done with it? You can get used to anything, was his mother's take, an inadequate reply to the question Charlie had asked, which was why do you want to boil a frog in the first place? The truth was, you had to be the frog to appreciate how life could get so intense that before you knew it, you were in over your head, the lid clanging shut above you. Charlie was the frog, of course, and the gradually heating water was life. So who's turning the dial on the stove? Oscar asked. Charlie was stumped. Mom, he ventured. Mom is the narrator. Narrator can't do Bacchus. Me, you, the fickle hand of fate, Charlie guessed, firing wildly. Nope, nope, warmer. Come on, Zeide, give me a clue. Oscar slapped his hand to his forehead, suddenly angry. You want a clue, Charlie? Here's a clue. Capital G, capital O, capital D. Got it? Charlie was chagrined. Here was his gentle Zeide, thumping his fist on the table and hollering out letters like a celestial bingo caller. God, Charlie, Hashem, Oscar hollered. He looked at his grandson, at Charlie's girth, his pale moonglow face and galaxy of Milky Way freckles. The dry red thatch of his hair seemed to be growing vertically, straight up from his forehead. His voice was pitched too high for a fella, no question. The boy had his head down, was staring at the table, gnawing distractedly at a thumb. With a pang, Oscar noticed the patch of acne flaring on his chin, inflamed and painful looking. Let the light of your precious self shine out into the world, he thought, gutted with tenderness. He touched his grandchild on the cheek, tilting his face gently until Charlie's downcast gaze met his own. Think of it this way, he whispered. Frog is the Jewish people. Water is 5,000 years of persecution. Hand on the stove is God. Thank you.
Okay, how can I follow that? Can we talk first about the title? Because I was struck by the fact that it seems like it's ominous, but it's not ominous, really. It's also sort of peppy and positive and optimistic, perhaps. And certainly the cover, which is very beautiful, and hopeful.
Yes.
Okay, so what does the title mean to you?
It's about the messy bits of life and accepting things that aren't necessarily perfect, but that are unique. And I wanted to write a character who, as I said, has intersex traits, and yet, and not to deal with that as a problem, to deal with it as a uniqueness, as a way of accepting and allowing someone to develop instead of making choices for the person. And as I researched for this novel, I read a lot of medical documents, which are quite difficult to figure out if you're a layperson, about intersexuality, and of course learn that it is a great violence done to children to make choices for them, to have surgical interventions and gender assignments, sex assignments. And so I felt that if I wrote a novel in which somebody had to choose, and that the end result was this person choosing, that I would in some way be replicating that violence. So the catastrophe is really a way of talking about life with all the messy and accidental and non-chosen bits, and learning to live with that.
Okay. And Charlie, there's many things about Charlie. There's his wonderful relationship with his grandfather. There's his interesting relationship with his mother. So the fact that he's born intersex is one thing among many things about Charlie. And he identifies seemingly at this moment as a boy, but he's hitting puberty, and he's running into other people's preconceptions, other people's prejudices. Now, in today's environment, there's a lot of emphasis often on lived experience, on embodied experience. Was it daunting taking on Charlie as your main character?
Very much so. Yes, and felt that I really had to read my way into this, try and understand the intricacies of intersexuality while being a cisgendered woman. I felt in so many ways, at the beginning, in the middle, at the end, that this was in some ways presumptuous of me to write a story that wasn't necessarily my story, but I persisted because I felt that there was a way of approaching this that hadn't been done. That I didn't want to write a spectacular story like Jeffrey Gennady's Middlesex. I wanted to write a story about somebody who is lucky enough to be blessed with a doctor who advocates for him, and so that his intersexual traits are the least important thing about him. And that's the story I wanted to write. And there's other characters who have different issues. His mother, for example, she had an accident a while, like when Charlie was 5, and as a result, she's mute. But she's an artist, and she always creates art installations and parodies this idea of her muteness as being important at all. So, for example, she parodies Van Gogh. The thing we know about Van Gogh is that he had cut off his ear, or the thing that people who don't know anything about art know about is that he cut off his ear. And so that she parodies this idea that anything that is perhaps not the norm is the most important thing about us, and in fact, it's the least important thing.
Yeah, and trauma is not the only thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. When I was reading this, I'm always interested in art, the relationship between art and life, and how that comes out through the creative process, and when I'm reading you, because I know you, and I know your lovely family, and I know this city, this crazy town of ours that you've been writing about for your last couple of books, and even knowing that the relationship between art and life is very complicated, very complex. It's not some kind of one-to-one thing. I somehow assumed that the dog Gilman, who's a major character in this story, I would say, the dog Gilman was based on your dog Maisie, and I should never assume anything, obviously, because you told me that that Maisie is kind of based on Gilman. In fact, that the way you put it was so beautiful. You said, "Well, you never had a dog before, and then you were writing about this dog, and you wrote yourself into having a dog and Maisie's just like Gilman, right? She's so you went out and picked one who was like the dog you'd written about."
Yes, I think with me, art comes first, and then life fits itself into the corners. I'd actually been. I was frightened of dogs. I grew up in a country where dogs were working animals, and they were usually slathering and in chains and barking. So I didn't really get the pet thing, and I'd always kept away from dogs. And then I wrote the book, and Gilman arrived as a character, and he demanded his voice, and he's in there. And then I got over my fear. I don't know how else to put it. I stopped being afraid and said, all right. Oh, I was the gatekeeper to the dogless household. I opened the gate. We now have a dog who turns out, you say, to be like Gilman. I don't know. She's a little bit perverse. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And another interesting kind of is that you were writing this partly during COVID, right?
Yes.
And it is a COVID novel, but it's not a COVID novel, like in really interesting ways. So how did that experience affect the novel and your writing of the novel?
Well, the novel began like 6 years ago, so it was a COVID-free, time, and I wrote and wrote and wrote. But all the time I was writing, I was searching for an ending that I had in mind, but that just wouldn't fit. The novel just wouldn't fit. So I was like, is this going to be the novel I have to, discard after 5 years because there's no ending? I was also writing contemporaneously, so the events in the novel were taking place at the same time as the the events as my life, just as the days. So I felt that this was a good way to keep track. So it was just easier to plot, saying, you know, because a lot of it is in the days are given, and so that was a good way of plotting, because I had a diary from 2019. So that was a good way of plotting. And I thought to myself, like, what could happen? This is fine. I can write a contemporary. It's like, what could happen? The first thing that happened was, this was just funny, was the, you know, every winter we all walk along the synagogue and see the warming huts, the Quincy's, and this is just one of my favorite things to do, and a moment of great hospitality, you know, these warming huts that are open to us. Well, that year, the year that, and one of the scenes takes place, an important scene takes place on the river in a warming hut. And that year, the river froze too quickly and we were not allowed on the river. So I thought, okay, so who's going to notice? You know, yeah, that'll be fine. And then, of course, 2020 happened, and I either had to change all the days and then go back much further, which wouldn't have been terrible, but it also was a way for me of realizing something about my novel, which is that Oscar is someone who talks about the way history collides with the present tense, because he went through the Holocaust and his life was changed utterly as a result. And so he tries to talk to Charlie, tries to talk to him in the sense of putting things in perspective. You know, this is the moment when history collided with the present. But of course, you children don't know that, because you've lived a life in which, you know, life has continued without history. And then we all experienced that time, you know, these unprecedented times. We experienced that moment where history collided with the present tense. And I thought that, gosh, I didn't say thank you. Yeah,
and it's the novel is heading toward its kind of ending, and then you realize, oh, it's that moment in March where we're all thinking, is this about to happen? Is this really about to happen? And I mean, I think 10 years from now, that's the moment I will most remember, that you know, that when we're on the precipice. So it's really interesting to see it in the novel as a kind of, this is also a really Jewish novel, and you know, I remember, you know, back in the 70s, novels were still kind of described, oh, it's as, you know, this is a Jewish novel, the great Jewish novel, you know, and I think that kind of that wasn't as common after that, except in the Jewish Post, of course, but maybe in mainstream coverage, it would be this is a novel that also is Jewish, but not sort of, this is a Jewish novel. And this one is like, is this your most Jewish book, would you say? And I mean, there's a bar mitzvah, there's a lot of Abraham and Isaac, like a ton of that. And there's the two old guys, you know, that fetching, and there's the rabbi, you know, who's a great character on the one hand, on the other hand, always, you know, and there's a lot of that in the novel, and there's a lot of theology, really, you know, and so tell us about that.
Well, it is a Jewish novel, yes, and I don't know what. I don't know where art comes from. I'd love to know. I don't know where characters come from. You know, something happens and you write your way into a sense of conviction. I think those writers I see nodding yes. It's not that I set out to write a Jewish novel at all. It's just that those were the characters that were loud and perverse and stayed the distance, you know, and that's what happened. But I loved Oscar's sense of religion and his interpretation and his perverse sense of exegesis, biblical exegesis, and he's explaining a lot of the Bible. He's preparing for his bar mitzvah, and he's explaining the stories of Abraham and Isaac's fathers and sons. Yeah, and I think that was the connection for me, was the father and son. And also, as grown-ups, I think we're haunted by the story of Abraham and Isaac in the way that children aren't. It's like as a child, it was just a Bible story. As an adult, it was just it was something that you had to keep thinking about and trying to figure out why would he do that? Like, why would any father do that? And no child ever thinks that, at least I've never met a child who's as horrified by that story as adults are. Just trying to find a way of reconfiguring that. Like, why would God want someone to do that? Why would you do that? Why would your son not be more important? Yeah. So I think the characters who are searching for their fathers or searching for their sons or their selfhood have to reckon with that story.
Yes. And Oscar's interpretations are always the rabbis. Yeah. This is also a really funny novel. I mean, like, laugh out loud, and it strikes me that is maybe one of the hardest things to do. I mean, I think people think that intense drama is really hard, but like humor's
comedy's difficult. Yes.
So how is that?
I guess, well, it wasn't. What's difficult is figuring out whether you want to make your reader laugh or be moved. And
you do both.
Thank you. But the thing is that if you, what I thought is that if some kinds of humor are very funny, but then they're a little bit glib, and I didn't want that. So I think the hard thing for me was pulling back and letting my characters not be as funny, so that they can, because I didn't want there to be sort of a carapace, that you can be really funny but then there's no pathos, because you are in a way laughing at your characters. And I never wanted to do that. I never found them funny. I found them endearing, charming.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't mean that I wrote them that way. I mean that when I lived with them in my head, their charm came through to me.
Yeah. Well, I think that the balance, I mean, there's situations where you think, oh, you have to laugh, because it's the full catastrophe. So you have to laugh, so I think that works really well. And you're also playing around, as John said, a lot with language, and a lot of it is third person sort of narrative, but there's also you're kind of having fun with all these other forms. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yes. So there are a number of emails and letters and computer files, and biblical exegesis and art installations. Well, it's part of it is telling a story from different points of view, and it's a wonderfully tricky and challenging thing to do, to move the story forward through voice. So there are different voices telling the story, but if you work, and this is what I tried to do, is just to move the story forward through these different voices, and it allowed you to skip a lot of exposition, which I loved. I guess there's just a clamor in my head. I wish. I would love to write a novel from one point of view. I'd love to be the kind of serene person where I could just write from one perspective and see it through to the end. But I have a bit of an ADHD brain, and there's just too many voices. But it was a joy. It was lovely writing from different perspectives and different people and using different kinds of language, because they're all, the way you write an email is different to letters. And some people still write letters. I mean, older people still write letters. And I have lots of old people in the novel writing letters.
Yes.
Art is a completely different, when you go, one of the things I love about the art installations that Quincy Hutz is reading the artist statements, and that's a different language. the kinds of ways you have of confessing are different. And
Yes. Yeah. That's a good point. The visual artists' art statements are wild sometimes. And there's Jules, the mother, who's she's very intense, I think, and she gets caught up in the work she's doing, and she kind of disappears, I guess, like literally, really sometimes. And I guess you've been interviewed a few times about this book already, and someone suggested, oh well, like the she's a monster, and you were like, is she? Is she a monster? Is she? So what does the character of Jules say about the creative process?
So a lot of people, who were first readers, my wonderful agent, Rachel Tatsky, said to me, well, this is not very sympathetic. The mother is quite a cold woman. I was quite shocked, because to me she was an artist. She was kind of just she wasn't cold. She was just making art, and at one point, and I know we had a discussion. And you said, well, she's done a lot of wrong things, doesn't she? And I know she's making art. The thing that she gives to Charlie, the great gift, is a kind of benign neglect, which allows him to grow up in his own way and find his own self. But I like your word, because I think in some sense artists are monsters. We have to be, otherwise we wouldn't create art. There's no reason to create art. How art is created is in defiance of our our prosaic lives, and our need to earn money, and our need to bring up a family. There's no reason otherwise. So we have to be monstrous, and I want to reclaim that word for all artists.
You're the nicest monster.
I always think of visual artists as being so much more and we were having this discussion. We decided we wouldn't bring this up in public. We're going to anyway. It's like my impression of visual artists is that they have so much, and I would love to hear what you think about this, is that they're so much more well balanced, so much more they're just more good-natured, because my big theory is that because you're playing with things that are things, they're made up things, and writers have to work with words, and so of course we're all neurotic, because words divide you from the inside, but things restore you, yes, connect you. That was my thing that we weren't going to talk about.
Yes, exactly. I believe that was
around general
relation.
Yes, it's not working.
But we're not naming names. I think it's time to open up to questions.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Gee.
In an indirect way, bringing up Abraham and Isaac, Kierkegaard. So I was curious whether that whole damn history of existentialism is even necessary to how you conceptualize the various catastrophes and dilemmas.
So the question is, bringing up Abraham and Isaac, Kierkegaard, is that whole damn history of existentialism necessary in working through those catastrophes?
Gosh, Jean, I'm so happy to have you here, but I don't know. Well, it is, and I was reading. I know Sarah has written a beautiful poem about Abraham and Isaac as well. Because I think we're all trying to grapple with this, with presence and presentness, and one of the things that Charlie comes to realize is that at that moment when Abraham was about to sacrifice Isaac, God was also there. And he was held he was also bound. He was also bound in that moment, and he was in danger of being sacrificed too. And so I think what Charlie realizes is that God sometimes is lonely, and he recognizes something about this formlessness of God, that perhaps he wanted a body, that perhaps he wanted a way of making contact. Sometimes, his grandfather says, Oscar says, sometimes God perhaps wants a conversation. And if he wanted a conversation, I bet you it would be with those existentialists.
I am what I am.
Eleni, here I am.
The question about process. You mentioned research and, medical research.
Yes.
So at what point did you decide, now I can write, or were you doing that concurrently?
Oh,
Right.
Alex, that's such a huge question, because I know you're obsessed with research, and for me, I took research much more seriously in this novel than I have in any others, but because it was such an important subject and I knew so little about the politics of it, and I wanted to get it right, and it was so important. But for me, it's always it's less important. So I used very little of the research, but I did a lot of it, and I used the research as a way of being a presence in my life and understanding the politics and the ideas behind intersexuality and that, but I didn't use a lot of it. So I put it all in, I took it all out. That was the time-consuming thing, which I think often happens with research and with writers, is, you put all the things that you feel holding you in place, and that justify what you say, and then you allow yourself to take it out. Yeah.
And actually, I should have brought this up before, because I think it ties in. Something that you brought up that I thought was very interesting was that the Anansi hired a sensitivity reader,
Mm-hmm.
which kind of, in a sense, checks,
Yes.
to make sure that whatever the research you've done is
Yes.
valid.
And yes, I had a sensitivity reader, and so because they were also concerned that this was, that the voice would not be saying anything untoward, or talking about disability in a wrong-headed way. So the person who helped me was quite wonderful, because his name's Hans Lundell. He helped me read medical journals more accurately. So that was important.
For those of you watching at home, the question was related to research and when Méira knew that enough research had been done and whether or not she was doing the research concurrently. We have a question from the internet now. Rona asks, when you look back to from the earlier drafts to the present, how would you say the plot or characters have changed?
That's interesting too. I think the main thing is the search for an ending, Rona, and trying to, having in mind what I thought the right ending would be, and realizing 3/4 of the way through that this wasn't the story that I was trying to write. That the ending that I had planned for was not the ending that the story demanded, and so then I was lost. Then I had to write without any structure and any ending, which is quite intimidating.
You talked about, you and Alison talked about Jules and her lack of presence within the book. And I had that feeling as well when I read it about her coming and Charlie was asleep or was about to go to bed and he stays home alone all the time. But at the same time, she's always there. The one thing that she's present for in his life is through her interaction with his teacher. And so I wondered, like, if that had more to do with the teacher, or if she, why was she so present in his schooling and not in the rest of his life?
Oh, the floor. Put your hand. Well, I think the teacher in some way irks the mother. Jules is such a rebel, and she really doesn't like to live within the confines of her life. And so she goes and creates art and rebels and lives a free life, and then the teacher comes in and tries to get Charlie to, swim within the lines, create the project that she wants him to create. And so in part her texting with the teacher and having a little brouhaha with the teacher is a way of saying, leave my son alone, let him develop in his own way.
So that answer is from a question regarding the presence or lack thereof of Jules in the book, which was mentioned earlier. However, Jules is very present when it comes to interactions with the teacher, and asking for elaboration on that.
I was wondering if the characters sometimes take Méira to characters themselves.
This is a question. Do the characters that you have invented, Méira, sometimes take you to a new and unexpected place?
Dog ownership.
Yes, they do, Faye. Yes, they do. But it's really hard to talk about this because it sounds then like your characters are in control of you. I reject that. I'm in control of them. But I guess living with these they seem real to me for so long, 6 years, and having no one to talk to about it. Because I don't really, I write and then when I feel it's ready, which often is in 6 years' time, I show people, but living with these characters and they influence me, I feel, as much as I influence them, but it feels, if you say that, it feels like it feels a little spooky. I'd love to know, I'd love to understand the creative process in a non-spooky way. But I don't yet.
Yeah, I'm interested in how you think about the place, the setting in which you tell your stories. And full disclosure, I haven't read this novel, but I've read your other three. And it struck me when I read those novels how important place was, so that the first two novels had to be set in South Africa. I mean, it just was it was just integral to the story. And then once more, the feeling was a very Winnipeg, Lake of the Woods kind of a novel. I'm just wondering how you think about place when you're in the writing process.
Yes, very much so. I felt at a certain point I couldn't keep writing about South Africa because I had been away for 25 years. So I couldn't legitimately write about it. I was still reading books set in South Africa. I was still reading the newspaper. I had family there, but it wasn't a lived experience anymore. My life is here, and place is really important, and the Winnipeg aspect of it is very important as well. Especially this novel is sort of set downtown in the Exchange District at a period, I think, where we are now. It's just between renewal and gentrification, and it's an interesting period, time. And I guess the place has to be alive for me, and have to imagine people moving through it. And if you can't do that, then you can't really. I mean, Margaret's written this amazing novel set in Vietnam, and but you went there and you walked around and you looked for your novel in all the places that it could be. But mine are not. You either have to go and search out your novel, or you have to find it in the places that you live, I guess, is the answer.
And those of you watching at home may have intuited that question was about the importance of place in Méira's novels.
I can't shut up. Just to orient you, in the latest book that I wrote, I made a character who had a point for the reader, and whether it felt visceral that this person could almost be alive or not wasn't as important to me as what she could personify in terms of what we now call issues. I hate that word, but that she was not just someone, as your characters are, that the reader, they're palpable almost, but to what extent you felt your characters had another role, which is literary in terms of effect of what the reader's thinking, not related. Does that even matter?
So this is a question from the wonderful novelist Jean Randolph, who mentions that in her own work, character has a point for the reader. The realism of her characters is sometimes less important than what they can personify, that those characters may not be as palpable as Méira's characters. And so she was asking Méira to meditate on that in a way and just respond.
Gosh, that's a doozy. I know what you mean, because I read and loved your novel. My characters are less interior, and the novel you're talking about, she's almost isolated, isn't she? So she's living this life that is between her ears. I feel like my characters don't live that much between them. These ones don't anyway. They're sort of interacting with each other and with their lives and their difficulties. It's less conceptual, I think. I love reading conceptual novels, but I haven't yet found a way of writing one.
Were there any other questions? Well, if there are no other questions, I'll turn things over to Alison and Méira. If you have any closing comments you would like to offer.
I just wanted to thank Méira for inviting me here tonight, and thank everybody for coming out, and to say that it's this novel is very much about communities, the ones you live in, the ones you create, and it's good to be back with people, and especially tonight.
Well, I want to thank Alison because, gosh, through all the years that we've lived in the pandemic year, and the thing that got me here tonight was knowing I'd be up here with you, and I won't be alone. I'll be having fun together. Thank you. Thank you all.
I will continue that gratitude in just a moment. But before I do, I have some thrilling notes about signing procedure for you. So as mentioned at the beginning, we'll ask you all just to remain in place for one moment while we move Méira along to the signing table. That is located immediately beside the cash desk. Please feel free to get in line and have a copy of the full catastrophe signed. There are copies at the signing table. There are also copies available at our central cash desk. You may pay for them first, you may pay for them after, just pay for them sometime. Other than that, thank you all so very much for joining us here, both presently and virtually as well. The video of this event will remain live on YouTube if you'd like to revisit it or share it with anyone else. Thank you all for your thoughtfulness, your attention, your questions, and I'll ask you all to join me one more time in thanking House of Anansi, your superlative host, Alison Gilmor, and of course, Méira Cook. Thank you all so very much.